Good. On a day like this, everything's good, right? It's beautiful, it's warm. And everyone is curious about what's going on with Rodin outside. It's covered up for conservation. So some conservators are going to come into town and work on it where it's got some wear and some weathering on it. So people have been asking me, so I'll just go ahead and tell you. We have great, interesting things coming up at the Dixon besides Munch and Learn today. And tomorrow is going to be a great day. We, of course, have Art After Dark, and we're going to have tours of the gardens and the galleries. So on the hour, we'll have garden tours, and on the half hour, we'll have tours of scent and symbolism. And there's also going to be a botany talk, and they're going to talk about the lily family. And, of course, Dixon Book Club happens every third Thursday, too. And even if you haven't read the book, which this month is Tulipomania, by the way, go ahead and come and kind of get the feel of it, and then you can read the book for next month. And this weekend, we have a workshop coming up with local painter Bill Branch, and it's going to be a spring watercolor class. And if the weather holds up, there'll be plein air painting, so you'll paint outside. And if it doesn't, we might just go to the green classes. But that is Friday night, 6 to 8, and Saturday you'll be painting from 10:30 to 2:30. You have to register in advance. There's room for one more person. So if more than one people want to see, you guys are going to have to arm wrestle or something to figure out who gets to do it. But on Saturday, we also have a workshop with Hannah Underhill photographing tulips. So make a reservation for that also. And this Sunday, you guys know that every Tuesday and Sunday we have tours at 2. But this Sunday, someone from the Alliance Française is going to do the tour. It's going to be a tour in French. So if you are practicing your French, you know someone who's working on their French, tell them to come at 2 o'clock for the tour on Sunday. And next Wednesday, Munch and Learn is going to be Flowers and Music, Scent, Sight, and Sound with Dr. Janet. I can't read today, I don't have my glasses on. Dr. Janet K. Page with the University of Memphis. And today, we're really lucky to have someone else from the University of Memphis. Hamlett Dobbin teaches foundations there. And he received his BFA from the University of Memphis and his MFA from the University of Iowa. And he has shown in regionally and also nationally, and in 2013 he was awarded the Rome Prize and spent 11 months as a fellow at the American Academy in Rome. And he lives here in Memphis. He's a native Tennessean, but he has lived in Memphis here for a long time with his 2 children, Mila and Ives. So, Hamlett Dobbins, everybody.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks to the folks here at the Dixon. Can everybody hear me okay? How you doing back there? Can you hear me okay? Next to the door?
A little higher.
Little higher. Okay, that sounds good. I know it's gonna be that kind of party. I'll be ready. Okay, so this is the image that I usually use. I give talks kind of all over the country, and I end up talking about my work a lot. And usually when I talk about my work, I usually like to start out with this image of barbecue. We're from Memphis. This isn't just any barbecue. This is barbecue from Cozy Corner. Cozy Corner is a restaurant that I like to go to. It's at North Parkway in Manassas. For me, Cozy Corner is sort of a happy place. It's also a place that I think of when I tell people to come to Memphis and have some barbecue. And so part of what I do when I go and I give talks out in the world is I try to be a kind of art evangelist. And so not only am I talking about my art, but talking about other people's art as well. And so when I go and I do that, usually talking about barbecue makes a lot of sense. It's a pretty smart thing to do. Now, I'm an abstract painter, so let me talk about how I'm an artist. I make paintings, and this is the kind of painting that I do. And a lot of times, folks will think that when you're an abstract painter, you kind of hang out with abstract painters, and you talk about abstract art and abstract thought a lot. But really, a very tiny part of my art diet is taken up with abstraction. For me, abstraction it's the way that my brain works, it's the way that I think. But it's not necessarily the thing that I use to round out my diet. And so one of the things we were thinking thinking about in terms of talking about a talk here at the Dixon was this idea of having a full art diet, you know, a full spectrum. And I know that some of us are connected to ourselves as children or know other children who will not eat the broccoli. And sometimes art isn't broccoli. Sometimes art is not necessarily just the broccoli, but sometimes we have to have the broccoli in order for us not to die. And so one of the things I wanted to talk to you guys about today was making sure that you maintain a strong, healthy, well-rounded art diet. And in order to do that, I may show you some images that might at first feel shocking or strange. I told Lindley this before I started the talk. Then Lindley said, don't worry about it. Kevin Sharp gave a talk last week where everybody in the slide talk, not here, but in the slide talk, they were all naked. So I feel totally fine. If Kevin is allowed to do it, then I'm allowed to do it too. And one of the things I want to do as I talk to you guys today is I want to talk to you about art viewing experiences. I want to talk to you guys about when I go and see art, the difference between seeing art on the television or on your computer or on your phone and seeing art in real life. And for me, one of the most powerful shows that I had seen in a really long time was a show by a guy named Kerry James Marshall. Now, Kerry James Marshall is an artist who was born in Birmingham, Alabama, and moved to Los Angeles when he was a young boy, and then sort of came into his own there in Los Angeles, and eventually moved to Chicago, and right now he has a career retrospective that's up at the LA MoGA there in Los Angeles. The show originated in the Museum of Contemporary Art there in Chicago. I'm sure you guys are here eating lunch at the Dixon, and so art is already a part of your regular practice. Art is a regular part of your diet. And so in some ways I might be preaching to the choir, but I just want to talk to you a little tiny bit about this Kerry James Marshall painting. Now, one of the things about Kerry James Marshall is that Kerry James Marshall very early on, when he was young, would go to museums, and he noticed that a lot of the faces that he would see in those museums, almost all of the faces that he would see in those museums, and the art, and then in the audience as well, were all images of white people. And Kerry James Marshall very early on realized that one of the things that he wanted to do is he really wanted to focus on his culture, to be able to focus on people who looked like him, and in part to make sure that in the future, people who went to the museum who looked like him would feel at home. There's a powerful thing that happens when you go to a museum and you see people who look like you, not just who look like you around you, but also who look like you on the walls. In part is because it becomes about importance, it becomes about power, it becomes about making sure that the hierarchy includes people who look like you. And so this is an image, it's a pretty late painting of Kerry James Marshall. It was done in 2012. It's called School of Beauty, School of Culture. There's a lot of stuff going on in this painting. And so when I went to go see this painting, one of the things that we notice a lot when we're painters is we notice how things are painted. And one of the things Kerry James Marshall is very aware of in his studio practice is to make sure that his art stands up, not just in terms of the contemporary art community, but also in terms of the canon of art. So that the art in some ways has to be undeniably good. So that someone says, oh, it's not just there because Kerry James Marshall's a black man, but it's there because it's a good piece of art. In fact, it's a phenomenal piece of art. And so when I was there, one of the things that really struck me, aside from the stripes that are happening in that pair of pants, and then also the color that's happening in the back of that little boy's jumper, was how it was painted. And so the painting itself is really masterful. In fact, the name of the show is Mastery. But what struck me was all of the things that happened inside that painting. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I'm a visual thinker, and so my brain, for the most part, takes in things purely with visual information. Rarely are there words or meaning associated with the things that I see. That's probably why I'm an abstract painter. But one of the things I couldn't help but notice in this painting was the way that that face at the bottom of it was tweaked and distorted. And so the image that we see in there is tweaked and distorted, not at all unlike this painting from the 1500s made by a man named Hans Holbein the Younger. It's a painting called The Ambassadors. Very different crowd, right? These are men of power, men of royalty, men of money. But then look at the weird thing that Hans Holbein the Younger does with that skull in the foreground. It's called anamorphic perspective, and it's where an image or a part of a painting is rendered in a way that can only be deciphered with the use of a lens or with a reflective surface. It's a little bit of a trick. This is kind of to it on your left, kind of giving it the once-over, kind of checking it out, seeing what's going on in there. And then once we realize it's a distorted image, those of us who grew up watching Disney movies might recognize it as Sleeping Beauty, this very Disney understanding of beauty, a blonde-haired, blue-eyed white woman. But here, we see this image of these women in the background, in the beauty shop. And so we see the kids sort of hanging out, they're walking around, we see a young woman there in the foreground, she's got her sippy, and then she's pointing to this weird anamorphic thing that's happening there. And then we see those stripes that I was talking about before. But take a look at what's going on in that painting. It's a pretty mundane thing. It's people hanging out in a beauty shop, getting their hair done. And for someone to be able to go into a museum, to be able to see that, and one of the powerful things about Kerry James Marshall now is that he's reached a point where museums are lining up for these paintings. And so Kerry James Marshall could make any painting that he wants, and he decides to make paintings like this. This painting, by the way, lives at the Birmingham Museum of Art down there in Alabama when it's not on tour. And so if you have friends or family down in Birmingham where Kerry James Marshall was born, maybe go by and check it out. That's a little nudge to the people at the Brooks Museum to maybe buy some more big art like this and have it going on. And so one of the other things that you'll notice about this is you'll notice how much information is going on in this painting. Not only is every person in the painting particular and specific, if you'll notice, everybody's hair is different, everybody's hair is well done, and then you'll also notice just the sheer quantity, the volume of things that are going on in this painting. And so here, Kerry James Marshall has given us, as viewers, an occasion to slow down. And so one of the things that I tell people a lot is when they go to see a show in a museum, try to slow down. Take your time. Don't rush. That person took a long time to make that painting. Now, some paintings just aren't good. Some paintings don't deserve our attention, or some aren't. Maybe we don't want to look at it. But the ones that we do like, the things that we are interested in, take your time. Slow down. And one of the things you'll notice in this painting is the image above the door, and then you also notice the poster over there on the right side of the painting. You can see a slide reference to the Miseducation of Lauryn Hill, a very important, wonderful piece of music. And then you can also see over there on the far right an image from Chris Ophelia, contemporaries of Kerry James Marshall's, another African artist. He's a British artist, but also an artist of the African diaspora. And so here you can sort of notice the other things that are happening inside this image. It's a powerful big piece. It's probably a wee bit larger than it is projected here. And to stand in front of it, it's one of those happy places that I go back to again and again. And so again, I'll say it again, slow down. And then this is a piece by one of my favorite artists, and so I realized I started off with some painting because I like painting. Painting's good, it's kind of my people. But one of the things I also like is I like to think about how people work outside of painting in terms of sculpture and in terms of performance. This piece may look a little strange to you. I'm glad it's projected as big as it is. This is a piece by an artist named Francis Elise. It's a piece called Paradox of Praxis 1. It's a documentation of an action. These stills, these are photographs taken from a video that's about 5 minutes long. And Francis Elise is one of those artists who has a really great website. And so if you're interested in his work, you can go and look on his website. And most of his performances are documented in videos that you can go and watch. And so Francis Elise is an artist who is kind of always thinking about poetic ways of talking about being in a city, poetic ways of navigating a space. And then sometimes that's enough. And then sometimes it's important for us to not just think about the thing that we see there, but if we're interested in that, if we feel like that's a little weird, or maybe it piques our curiosity, go and do some more research. And so, for example, with Kerry James Marshall's painting, I was talking about the Miseducation of Lauryn Hill album cover, the poster, the Hans Holbein, the Younger painting. Now, some of us will get those references, some of us have never heard of Lauryn Hill. But one of the things that's important is that we think about taking the piece of art on its own, and then eventually we're able to sort of come to it with a kind of understanding. Maybe we've seen it several times, maybe we've read an article about it, but that Kerry James Marshall painting is a feast for the eyes, whether or not you get those teeny tiny little references or not. But by getting those references, you have a fuller, deeper, richer experience. Not at all unlike listening to a piece of music, or eating food, or drinking wine. And so here with Francis Elise, it helps us if we understand that Francis Elise is a Belgian artist, born in Belgium, trained as an architect. He moved to Mexico City after one of the big Mexico City earthquakes to help rebuild the city. He found himself very out of place. He is a very tall, very thin, very pale man. And so this is an early piece that he did where he would line up on the street there with the other guys who were the day laborers. And so over there you see a painter, you see a plumber, you see an electrician, and then he's advertising his wares as a tourist. And his pieces, like I said, are really interested in navigating a city. And so here we see one of his really early pieces when he was there in Mexico City. He built a little tiny rolling dog that was magnetized, super magnetized. And so when he would roll it through the streets like walking a dog, it would collect the teeny tiny pieces of metal trash that were all over the city. And then at the end, you would have this collection of metal trash that was on top of this thing. And it's a very poetic way of thinking about navigating a city. It's also a poetic way of thinking about collecting things. It's also kind of an analogy in terms of thinking about how dogs pick up all kinds of stuff. This is a really beautiful piece, but a piece that took a lot of action. This was not a simple act like pushing a huge block of ice through a very hot city. In this piece, when faith moves mountains, he takes this reference from the Bible and he involves 500 volunteers to line up in this one sand dune in Lima, Peru. And each person lines up with the shovel and they move the sand dune by just 5 centimeters or 10 centimeters. And so they take a little scoop, scoop it up, and take a little scoop, and scoop it up, and they carry it all over the mountain. And so the mountain, in theory, is moved just a tiny little bit. This was another piece that Francis Elise did later when MoMA moved from MoMA in Manhattan over to MoMA, Queens. It was a call back to some things that we see a lot of times in Latin American culture, in particular Catholic communities, where the relics from the church are sometimes taken out and taken into the street as a form of parade, but also this idea of taking the relics out to the people. And this was a piece that Francis Elise did called The Modern Procession. And in this piece, he had replicas of his various pieces, particularly famous pieces from the MoMA collection, and then made a parade complete with a roving band, and they played music, and they went all the way from Manhattan over into Queens, where MoMA PS1 was located. This is another piece, one of my favorite pieces ever. This is a piece called Milk Pour. It's made by a guy named William Popel. William Popel is an artist who used to live in Maine. He advertises himself as the friendliest black artist in America. And Popel is known for making art that deals with identity, not just in terms of race or in terms of culture, but also in terms of very old ideas of purity. And so here we see him using this a very simple thing. What could possibly be simpler than getting a gallon of milk and then pouring it into a gutter? And so one of the things I like about this is that in some ways it becomes poetic. It's a very simple thing. No, you can't buy it. It's a piece of art that's been poured down the gutter. But it's a piece of art that we can see, and it's a way for us to kind of think about it in terms of how these things work. Now, this is another artist, completely different artist. This is a man named Wolfgang Leib. And Wolfgang Leib is kind of a monk. He hangs out and he collects pollen from hazelnut trees, and he does these very quiet, sort of contemplative pieces. This is a piece that he did called Milkstone. It's a piece of white marble, very clean, very smooth. And then he poured milk on it so that the milk would cover the stone, and then it would get right to the edge, and with milk tension, it would sort of form sort of a meniscus layer there on the outside. Now, for me, one of the interesting things about this is that how this fits into a very monastic, sort of quiet, contemplative, slow space Wolfgang Leib, and how essentially the same action can be done by a different artist and have it carry completely different meanings. And so here I would make the argument that Wolfgang Leib is better because of William Popel, and William Popel is better because of Wolfgang Leib. I like this idea that in the art world, there are these conversations, sometimes quiet, sometimes unintended, that happen between artists over a great divide. And so one of the things for me that's very powerful about going and seeing art is to be able to think about those connections. How is Wolfgang Leib connected to William Popel? Obviously very different ideas, but also very simple, very pared down, very poetic, almost the way a haiku has only the essential number of syllables, no more, no less. This is a piece by a woman named Catherine Opie. Catherine Opie another artist who was really interested in using the museum space, using the gallery space to talk about things that she was interested in, to be able to show things that she was interested in. There's an exercise I do all the time with my students where I say, okay, what you gotta do is close your eyes, imagine an empty room in the basement of a museum. Now imagine it filled with the kind of art that you want to see, the kind of art that you want to spend time with. And now you go and make that art. That's the art that you're supposed to make. And so here, Catherine Opie does this. Catherine Opie, again, like Kara James Marshall, did not see enough of herself and her people in galleries and museum spaces. Catherine Opie is a queer woman who lives there in Los Angeles, has been a photographer for a long time. And this was a piece that she made in 2004 after giving birth to her son, Oliver. And so Oliver is nursing the mother. Now, these are things that we don't normally see. Sometimes there's a big hubbub over being able to see a woman breastfeeding in public. They got to be covered up. They got to go into a special room. Also, we don't normally see nude images. Nude is when your clothes are off. Naked is when your clothes are off and you're up to something. So here, Catherine is just nude. And so it's very rare that we see an image of a large woman who's older, who's not a supermodel, who's not a Playboy centerfold, in a piece of art. And so it was important for Catherine Opie to be able to see this. Also, this image is maybe a little bit smaller than it is projected. Usually it's seen as 40 inches by 30 inches, and it's a photograph. And so what it shows is it shows the reality of the scene. And one of the things that we notice in the image is you can see some small scarification marks on the upper breast of Catherine Opie. And the small scarification marks are taken from an earlier piece that she did where she had a friend who was like a tattoo artist, but instead of using ink, used a very small scalpel to scar the surface of the skin. And so you can see where she's carved the word pervert into her chest. You can also see where she's wearing a bondage mask. You can also see where her arms are pierced with needles. And so here, Catherine Opie again is sort of talking about things that are usually not seen in public, also things that are usually, for the most part, hidden, sort of private. Catherine Opie talks about this piece. Now, again, this piece was done 10 years before the piece with her son. And so here with this image, she talked about how she had to come out twice. She had to come out to her mom and dad who knew about her being a lesbian. She had to come out to them as being a lesbian. But then years later, when this piece was written by she also had to come out as what you call a pervert. And so again, this is one of those things where a lot of times we may be taken aback by it, but part of art is to be able to make the thing that is unseen seen. And sometimes that talks about things that we're passionate about. Sometimes it's about things that make us excited. Sometimes it's about things that make us ashamed. Sometimes it's about all of those things. And for me, the interesting thing about the image before, the image of Catherine Opie nursing her son, was the fact that it was very similar in terms of formal qualities. She is a person there, shirtless in a chair, standing in front of a very ornate image. And for me, this image makes that image more interesting. Also, thinking about aging and sexuality in terms of this was happening 10 years before, and can a person be a parent and still be a sexual being? And so here we've got another series. One of the things that Catherine Opie, one of the things that the self-portrait / pervert piece really did for her was it made her really think about her own particular community and the sort of mundane qualities sometimes of that community. And she's always done art about different subcultures, different marginalized groups of one form or another. This was a series that she did where she photographed queer couples and their adopted children or their biological children. These were friends of hers. And then these images are not the normal staged images, that we see, the Olin Mills photographs of us sort of standing there at a nice wooden fence in front of a barn. These are images of people getting breakfast ready, taking a moment in between snacks, making sure that the house is a little crazy. This is a photograph of Catherine Opie again. This is a photograph that was taken by her partner, Julie. And again, this was a series of very straightforward but very beautiful photographs that portrayed domestic life. Domestic life that in many states was sort of seen as deviant or against the norm. And then this was a piece by a guy named Vito Conchi. Now, Vito Conchi to me is one of the most interesting performance artists around. And one of the things that I'm talking about Vito Conchi for is that Vito Conchi came to town and he did an artist talk. He did a piece for the Urban Art Commission called Roof Like Fluid Flung Over the Plaza. And it's a piece that he did for the Urban Art Commission that's there in the Cannon Center. And one of the things that was interesting for me is that Vito Conchi is an older artist. This was a piece that he did sort of late in life. He's still alive. And this was a piece that he did very early on. And I was super curious to find out how this piece from 1969 led to the piece that he did, the kind of work that he was doing later. So I went to an artist talk. And so the moral of the story is go see artist talks. And so one of the things that he did so unbelievably eloquently was he was able to build a bridge between these pieces that he made very early on and the pieces that he made late. This particular piece is called Following Piece, and he was invited along with a bunch of other performance artists in the 1960s to do a piece in response to the city of Manhattan, to New York. And what he did was he would leave his house every day for 23 days. At the very beginning of the day, he would pick a person at random, and then he would follow them through the city as long as they stayed in a public space. Once they entered a private space, he would stop following them, and he would maintain a safe distance. And he said sometimes what he did was he would go out, and then he'd start following somebody, and he'd go into a private residence, and his day was done. Some days he would go out, and that person would go shopping, or go see a movie, or they'd go out for dinner. And he said some days lasted the whole day. And so one of the things he's doing here is he's thinking about living in a city, thinking about how our bodies navigate this city, also in terms of our vulnerability, in terms of being in the city and then being followed by people, people's fears and worries. He did a lot of other pieces too. If you want to see some stuff that'll make you really scared, look at some of Vito Conchi's early work there on the interwebs. And then this is an image by a woman named Nan Golden. Actually, it's a series of images. And Nan Golden is one of my favorite photographers, as much as Catherine Opie and Reneke Dijkstra. And Nan Golden was a part of a group of artists and musicians and poets and writers who were active in New York City in the 1980s and 1990s. And it was a pretty important, powerful time during the history of New York City in terms of it being a creative community. And in Nan Golden's work, you see how she hangs out with these people. And these aren't just subjects. These are her friends. These are people that she hangs out with. And so a lot of times in these images, you can see this image of a woman named Cookie, and then Cookie is the woman on the left. And then through Nan Golden's shows, usually the way she'll present her work is via slide projections. And she'll have 8 or 9 slide projectors going, and they'll show a series of slides. And what will happen is a kind of quiet narrative is formed. And so you're able to sort of see a bunch of these images, and you're also able to see these people at different times in their lives. And so what Nan Golden does is she sort of presents us with a cross-section of full life. And part of that has to do with sadness, and some of it has to do with death and illness. In particular, during this time, this was during the Great AIDS epidemic. And so lots of people in her group of friends were slowly lost. And so I went to go see this show, this Nan Golden show, and I found out that there was a Nan Golden show that was going on in Houston when I was down there doing a tour with my kids. And I broke away from the kids and I went to the MFA there in Houston. And when I got there, across the street from the MFA in Houston is the Contemporary Art Museum. The Contemporary Art Museum had hired a high school band to play some music, and there were a bunch of high school kids hanging out. And I was like, oh no. And then I got to the MFA and I went in and they had this huge black curtain across the front of the entryway so that people couldn't look inside just in case they happened to see a breast or a booty. And so what happened, there was a huge sign. The sign said, the images inside this exhibition may be disturbing to some viewers. And I thought, oh no, this is not going to be good. And I went in and there were a bunch of high school kids, and I thought, oh no, high school kids are going to be cutting up, they're going to be pointing to all the boobies, all this other stuff. And I've never had an experience like this. They moved around that space with such quiet and such reverence, and they took each image in, and you could see where they were seeing how, oh, this is that woman from over there, and this is that woman from over there. fringe community. When you're a kid, people sometimes don't pay attention to you. And a lot of her friends were a part of a marginalized community. They were these rebels, these weirdos that lived in these tiny little lofts there in New York City. And it was such a powerful moment to go through and to see this art with these kids and to listen to the kids watch the art. And it's such a powerful, interesting thing to hear people see things and relate to things and talk about things and bring their own stories to the images that we were seeing. Now, this is one painting by a guy named Leon Gottlieb. I'm not going to talk about Leon Gottlieb too long. Leon Gottlieb was kind of a funny dude. He came to the University of Memphis as a visiting artist when I was an undergrad. It's about this tall, looks like Yoda. It's got kind of Yoda ears. It's got kind of crazy fuzzy hair. He sounds a little bit like Oprah from Dark Crystal. Anyway, Leon Gottlieb made some of the scariest paintings I've ever seen. This is an image from the 1980s called Interrogation. Some of you guys remember some of the things that were going on politically in the United States in the 1980s. There was some crazy stuff that was going on abroad. That's a nice thing about getting to talk to people who have lived. They kind of remember the things that happened in the 1980s. And then, years later, I went to go see Leon Gottlieb show. It was there at the Brooklyn Museum of Art. And I was like, I'm going to go see that Leon Gottlieb show. And I did. I went through it and whoa, there was a lot of stuff going on in that show. And then at the end, my favorite part was the book, the little guest book where people would sign in. Here's tip number 4 from Hamlett during today's talk. Always read the guest book. It's kind of like the comments section on Facebook. And so it was full of comments like, why don't you have some flowers up in here? Why don't you put something pretty in here? Why don't you how come you want to show us all this scary stuff? And then the last entry said, I love Leon's paintings because he is my granddad. Yeah. Always read the comments. Now, all of this is not to poo-poo Edgar Degas. I love Edgar Degas. I'm not saying you guys don't need to look at Edgar Degas. I'm saying Edgar Degas is a part of Balanced Breakfast, right? So remember when you were kids and you watched the Tony the Tiger, it's a great thing, and then they would have this sugar-coated crazy cereal, and they'd be like, Frosted Flakes are a part of a nutritious breakfast, and then they have all the nutritious stuff kind of around the Tony the Tiger. That's what we're talking about. Now, again, we're talking about taste. Now, sometimes people like barbecue. Some people like blood sausage. That's what I tell my kids all the time. They're like, I don't like broccoli. And I'm like, I understand that, but some people eat blood sausage. And so you need to understand that I'm not serving you blood sausage, but I am serving you some broccoli. Now, I'm not saying that we only eat cozy corners, and I'm not saying that we only eat blood sausage. In the same way that I'm not saying that we should only drink Guinness Stout and not drink Bud Light Margaritas, although I cannot imagine any reason to ever drink a Bud Light Margarita. Again, part of a healthy diet. Now, one of the things I think sometimes can get in our way when we go into museums is this idea of the virtuoso. We all know this kid. He kind of ruined it for everybody. Mozart, right? The reason he ruined it is that he was surrounded by all of this crazy myth. It was like he wrote his first opera by the time he was 5. He wrote his first blah, blah, blah by the time he was 6. And then you're just like, I could never do that. I'm 47 years old. If I wanted to start making music now, how could I do it? Mozart did it so much better. And so a lot of times when we go to museums, we hear people talk about how my kid could do it. And for me, that's a powerful thing. It's an empowering thing to think that someone could do this who isn't necessarily skilled.
They're born that way.
Say again?
They're born that way.
Mozart was born that way, and he had a crazy dad. He beat him a lot. And so part of it is being born that way, part of it is also having a crazy dad. Now, this is a piece by a guy named John Cage. Now, this was a piece that was done in 1952. This was a long time ago. This is a piece that still gets people's hackles in an uproar. And so this is a piece called 4 minutes, 33 seconds. And John Cage came out and he sat down and he was still and quiet for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. And so part of what happens in there is it's about the performance. It's about being in the room. It becomes about the kinds of sounds that we're hearing elsewhere, the things that aren't necessarily the music, in air quotes. Now, I'm not saying that we have to just like Mozart, we have to just like John Cage. This is not 1984, we're not talking about Rat and Motley Crue. You can like both rap in Motley Crue, you don't have to worry about just liking one. Now back to John Cage. Now it's important for us to keep in mind with John Cage that John Cage, like most artists, did not fall to earth from outer space. He was born of a long tradition. And so one of the things that informed John Cage was that there were several artists who were a part of the Jewish diaspora, who were trying to escape some of the crazy things that were happening there in Europe at the time, and came to the United States. Two of those particular artists, one, Hans Hoffman, imaged on the upper left, the other, Arshil Gorky, imaged on the lower left. And so here, Arshil Gorky and Hans Hoffman weren't just artists who would come to a town and sit in their studio and hole up and just make art. They were social beings. They were teachers. And they became the cornerstones, the essential part of a real community that happened there in New York at the particular time. And one of the things that they were interested in wasn't necessarily art as a kind of observational painting, but art as a kind of action. And they gave rise to the abstract expressionists, a group of artists who really put the United States on the map in terms of the global art culture. And the idea with those guys was that when you would come to a painting, you wouldn't necessarily have a preconceived idea. The painting, the canvas, became a document of the artist's experience, the painter's experience. You can see where painters made mistakes, you can see where painters changed their mind, you can see where one move led to another move. And so this idea of art as a kind of performance became really important. Now the guy on the right is a guy named Alan Capro. Alan Capro was an artist who was also really influential, also a teacher, and he began doing these projects called happenings, and they were basically performance art pieces that would go on at a particular site. And part of what they were doing is they were rebelling against this idea of art as an object, as a product, as a thing that can be bought or sold. Again, when you think about William Bell, you can't buy that milk pour. You could buy a gallon of milk and then pour it down the sewer. That might be kind of interesting. And so one of the things that happened is that John Cage was sort of born from this idea of performance, and also performance as an experience, not necessarily as a thing that we hear, but as a thing that happens to us, around us. Now, there's lots of artists that I like who are ninjas, kind of like Mozart. Vermeer is one of those artists. I have seen a lot of Vermeer's paintings, and I look at those paintings, and I'm a painter. I went to school and I learned how to paint, and I've painted for a long time. When I look at these Vermeer paintings, I do not know how they were made. They were born of Hamlett, of silk and honey and gold, and I have never seen anything like them. And they strike awe and fear into my tiny, cold, dead heart. And so one of the things that I like about Vermeer is that he does that. But there's also some things that are interesting to me too. So there's a project by a couple of artists, Alain de Botton and John Armstrong. It's a project that they did called Art is Therapy. And this was a thing that was really powerful to me. It was a piece that was done in connection with the Rijksmuseum there in Amsterdam in 2014, and I was able to see the show. And basically what they did was they put up these little post-it notes, not little post-it notes, huge post-it notes sort of throughout the museum. So here it says, we are often left, in parentheses, secretly cold and unimpressed before some works that, in theory, we regard as masterpieces. Another thing that he said was that people who readily accept the need to go to a gym may bristle at the suggestion that they might also go to a museum to work on their character and aspire to virtue as keenly as they do to physical fitness. Now, I don't say that we're all virtuous. I think to say that a group of us hanging out in this room talking about art or virtuous might be a little too self-congratulatory. But I do think that one of the things that we have to do to feel like we get a full experience from art is to do a little work. And then this leads me to maybe the last story. And so this was an image of a woman named Katie Newell and a guy named Thomas Leslie. And we went to a city in Italy called Naples, down there towards the bottom. And we went there and we had two main objectives. One objective was to go to Starita's and have some pizza. Our second objective was to go to a small chapel there called Cappella San Severo, and to see a piece called Veiled Christ by a man named Giuseppe San Martino. Now, the Veiled Christ is a piece of art person. If I were to show you images of veiled Christ here projected on the screen, it would be bad. It would not be nice. And so one of the things that was powerful for me about going to see this piece was that at the front door, it said no photography. And then earlier in the day, we had gone to the National Archaeological Museum there in Naples, and it was totally fine to take pictures. And people would tour up with their selfies, people were backing into ancient sculptures, taking selfies, and they were like, taking pictures. And any of us who've been to see a Vermeer in real life know that that experience is not like what I just projected. There's going to be people in front of you, people holding up their cameras. The last time I went to the Louvre to look at a Vermeer painting, I was standing there for a long time. A German man tapped me on the shoulder and asked me to move. A painting had been there for 200 years. It's not going anywhere. Relax. And then, as I sat there, another man took his camera and put it over my shoulder to right about here to take a picture of it. It's 2017. That image that I found of the lace maker, it took me 0.0009 seconds to find it on Google image search, and that's a high-res image. Just look it up and Google it. Don't take a picture of it. It's okay. Now that's me being the old fart who's kind of like grumping about these whippersnappers with their phones in the museums. But one of the important things that I noticed about being in that museum, in that tiny little chapel there in Naples, was that people slowed down. When I was there in front of that mirror, people would be all, they'd be out of there, right? But in that other place, looking at the veil of Christ, everyone was slow. Everyone was also very quiet. Now, the veil of Christ is a life-size sculpture of Christ after he's been crucified, is laying on a slab. And over Christ's body, obviously, it's called veiled Christ, is a very thin, gauzy layer, but it's rendered in marble. And so when you look at it, you can see the places where the cloth is pulled away from the skin. You can see the places where the cloth goes over the knuckles. It's beautiful. It's unbelievable. We stayed in there for an hour and a half looking at this one sculpture. It was amazing. And so here the idea, or the thing that I say to you is, again, slow down. Put your phones away. Look at it. There's been lots of studies, by the way, that show that memory is enhanced by slow looking and not by photographing. They gave people cameras, a select group cameras to go into a museum, a select group without cameras, and then quiz them about the contents of the museum, and the people who took the photographs did much poorer on the test. So, there's science. Now, on the way back from Naples, it was a very long train ride. Those two people and I talked about our favorite sculptures. We asked ourselves, what's your favorite sculpture? Is it Veiled Christ? And I was like, I don't know, it's pretty close. It was pretty great. And then, right when we got into the road station, I realized that it was really this piece. Now, to talk about it, it's a little tough. And so, to talk about it alone is a little tough. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to back up just a tiny little bit, and I'm going to talk to you about the artist in question. The artist in question is a man named Felix Gonzalez Torres. Now, Felix Gonzalez Torres was an artist who was born in Cuba, immigrated to the United States via Puerto Rico, came to the United States in 1979 when he was an adolescent. And then he went to school for photography and for poetry. And Felix Gonzalez Torres was a queer artist, active in the 1980s and 1990s. Now, the good thing about talking to those of you in the room who are older, remember the 1980s and the 1990s with our queer friends. When I was a kid, I had an uncle, I have an uncle still, named Jack. And I asked my uncle, I said, did you know anyone who died from the AIDS epidemic? He lived here in Memphis. And he said, yeah, I knew a lot of people. He said he lost 50 friends to the AIDS epidemic. That's in Memphis, Tennessee. He lost 50 friends to the AIDS epidemic. I cannot imagine any of us, if we sat down and we made a list of our friends and we checked off 50 of them, that wouldn't be affected by that. And so it was a powerful thing. You know the political ramifications of the 1980s and how it looked there, and then how people from this particular marginalized community were treated in a kind of institutional marginalization and ignoring what was going on in terms of the AIDS epidemic. And Felix Gonzalez Torres' work was in some ways about the AIDS epidemic. It was about the loss of the body. Now, some of us may not have been touched by the AIDS epidemic, but we've all lost people to cancer. And we all know the very slow, very quiet way that they go. Their bodies slowly degrade and they slowly disappear. And then Felix Gonzalez Torres was interested in making art that would be able to do something like that. And so one of the things that he was interested in was he was doing these pieces with candy. And so this is a very large carton of candy. The candy is displayed, the name is untitled, and then in parentheses it says revenge. And it's a pile of candy, a square of candy that weighs 325 pounds. That's the combined weight of Felix Gonzalez Torres and his partner, Ross Laycock. And so one of the things that happens when you go into a museum and you see the Felix Gonzalez Torres piece is that you're immediately aware that you can go up and take a piece of that candy. And so you go up and you take a piece of the candy. Who doesn't like candy? I like candy. And so you take a piece of candy and then you eat the candy. And then part of what happens is the piece of art slowly disappears. Now, this particular piece for Felix Gonzalez Torres with his candy pieces, sometimes they would have different parameters. Now, sometimes what would happen is the piece would have to be installed